So, getting on to today's service. Today's reading comes from John 14, and it's verses 1 to 14. And it starts like this. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way to the place where I am going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you know me, you will know my Father also. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father, and we will be satisfied. Jesus said to him, have I been with you all this time, Philip, and you still do not know me? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am the Father and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. But if you do not, then believe me because of the works themselves. Very truly I tell you, the one who believes in me will also do the works that I do, and in fact will do greater works than these. Because I am going to the Father, I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If in my name you ask me for anything, I will do it. There's that joke, I don't know if you know it, about a person who goes to the doctor, and the doctor says, I've got really bad news to tell you. Well, I've got bad news and I've got really bad news to tell you. And the guy says, okay, doc, just tell me the bad news. Just start with the bad news and then we'll go to the really bad news. And he says, well, you've got 24 hours to live. And this guy goes, that is terrible news. And he's mortified. He says, well, if that's the bad news, what's the really, really bad news? He says, well, I should have told you yesterday. I don't know about you, but I've been told by people who have been given a terminal diagnosis, or they've been told that they've given very short time to live, that you start to live differently when you've got that diagnosis. You almost receive a filter and you start to judge what's important and what's not important. And so you start to see the world with new eyes. Or I've been told when you come close to death, when you've been in that car accident that's almost taken your life, or you got really, really sick and you've come back from that you live in a different way. You smell things that you didn't smell. You see things you didn't see. The stuff that you overlooked or you thought was important, well, that all just fades into the background because, well, it's not that important anymore. Grief has a way of just putting things into focus. It sharpens our senses in some ways. It's almost as if when we experience grief in some way, it's like putting on a pair of glasses. When I have my glasses off, I struggle to see. Everything is a bit blurry. But when I put the glasses on, everything comes into focus again. And in today's reading, Jesus says, do not let your hearts be troubled. And I don't know about you, but I hear that verse quite a lot at funerals. It's quite a favorite. People ask for it. And for a long time, I assumed that verse was really about just toughening it up. Like this grief process, well, you'll get over it. Don't let your hearts be troubled. Believe in me. Don't worry. Just get over it. Get over yourself. Put on a brave face and just smile, and you'll get through. That smile though your heart is breaking, kind of thing. And it's almost as if, as I understood this verse, that Jesus was saying, don't worry about this world. The real gift is in the next world. And so you just stick it out. Just stick it out. But as I was reading this verse this week, it really just challenged that understanding, because I read the verse before, and what happens in the chapters before this verse is that, or the chapter before this verse, is that Jesus starts off by washing the disciples' feet. He washes his disciples' feet, and he says, that he's preparing them. He's preparing them. Then next on, after he's washed their feet, is he predicts that Judas is going to betray him. He predicts that Judas is going to betray him. And then after that, just after that, he says that then Peter's going to betray him. So he has these three clear things. And he's painted a picture of suffering. Jesus in this moment has painted a picture of his suffering to his disciples. And then he just says to them, do not let your hearts be troubled. Now, I don't think that what Jesus is doing here is saying that, I've painted this picture of suffering, but you don't worry about it. You just keep gung-ho, you just keep following through. Don't have any grief. I don't think that's what Jesus is saying here. I think what Jesus is saying is that in my house, there are many rooms. And in this place, or in this place of grief, there is always a room for you. You will not be left out if you are grieving. You will not be excluded from what God is doing if you are grieving. In fact, the word, we often translate it in my house there are many rooms. Or in this translation that I read, is in my house there are many dwelling rooms. A better translation would be, in my house there are many places for you to abide. Many places for you to abide. And Jesus, because the Greek is very similar to, later on, is the verb abide. And so what I think Jesus is saying here is, there is a space for you to come and stay and to share in it, where we can share this. When grief is at your door, when grief is part of your everyday life, when grief is something that you're experiencing on a day-to-day basis, in God's house, there's a place for you. A place for you not to be ashamed of your grief, not to feel, I shouldn't be grieving, but a place to bring it. I don't know about you, but grief is not something I live with day to day. And what I mean by that is that grief, in the sense of my own life, is not something I live with day to day. I feel like I'm immortal, in the sense of, I don't think death is going to be knocking on my door tomorrow. But I live in a way that puts death quite far away. I live in a place where I put grief off. I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to even have it in the forefront of my mind. I don't want to even have it at the back of my mind. I just don't want it. So I live in a way that just as if I'm going to live forever. And so what has happened during Corona, or during the COVID crisis, is that grief has become central and a part of our day-to-day lives, hasn't it, in some ways? Whether it's grieving the death of a ritual. Like the ritual of going shopping together, or the death of maybe a loved one, or the death of a community, the death of the loss of going to church, the death of so many things is happening at the moment. And in the last week in particular, I've noticed that people around me and myself are starting to feel the burden of this grief. We're starting to experience grief as if it is part of our day-to-day life. And so what has happened is that it started to give us new eyes to see the world. And one of the things I've really been struck by is that there are many people in our world and in our community where grief is a natural part of their day-to-day life. Whether they've lost someone special to them, or they're dealing with a terminal illness, or they are struggling with a child who's very sick, who constantly, there's a constant worry about that person. Or for some people, lockdown is not something that happens when Corona was around. Lockdown is something they live with every day because they're housebound. So they live in a world of grief and of sorrow and of loss. And that becomes their norm. What's interesting for me is that I'm only starting to taste this world that they are living part of, or that they form part of. I'm only starting to learn to experience what some people live with day to day. I don't know about you, because I put things, or because I live as if I'm immortal, I put things off. I don't deal with these kind of things, but because it's now part of my life, well, I'm learning. I'm learning from this. And what happens when these things become part of your life is you become angry, you become agitated, you become hopeless. I don't know if you felt any of those feelings in the last couple of weeks. I certainly have. I've really felt agitated. I've been angry. I just want to go out. In some ways I felt hopeless. But the thing about grief, as I said earlier, is grief sharpens our senses, doesn't it? Grief sharpens our senses. And because, we start to live in new ways because of the grief. We value a hug in a way we never valued a hug before. Recently, this morning I was watching the news, and there was a lady in America who'd put up a plastic shield, like a plastic sheet, and she'd put in a place for her arms to go through, covered in plastic, and she put it over her front door, and she would encourage her students. She was a teacher. She'd stick her hands through, and then her students would come and she'd give them a hug through this plastic, because she valued a hug in a way she'd never done before. I don't know, we're starting to value the gift of conversation. Yesterday, I went walking around the Beveridge Park, and I bumped into Marina and Anne. And it was just lovely to actually see someone that wasn't a reflection on a computer screen. To actually have a conversation with a real life human being. It was something I would take for granted. But because I'm dealing with grief day in and day out, these are the things that I wish I hadn't taken for granted before. The joy of seeing family and friends, we've taken that for granted, but grief, because we miss it now, because it's a form of loss, we now value it. And we're starting to see the world in new ways because of grief. What are some of the things that you miss? What are some of the things that you wish you hadn't taken for granted? If we abide in Jesus, I think two things happen. Well, firstly, I think Jesus, if we abide in properly, or we are honest with our feelings. we are honest about it. Like, we're honest about our grief. We're honest about the things that we've lost. We're honest about it. For too long, I think, as a society, especially in the West, we've hid from death. We've hid from our grief. And I think abiding means we say, like, this is really difficult. You know, name your grief. And the second thing, I think, what happens when we abide is that, especially, well, we abide in Jesus, is that we experience love and a love that holds us. There's that famous hymn, a love that will not let me go. And that is really, really important. If we are honest and we experience love, well, it transforms our grief. It transforms us. It transforms the way we react. I remember when my mom died, and I came back to Scotland after I'd done the funeral. The first thing I did was I picked up Francis and I gave him a big hug and I just said, I love you. And the second thing I did was I gave Emily a hug and I said, Emily, I love you. Because love, well, grief, if we're honest about our grief and we are engaged with love, it makes us live in a new way. We start to value what's important around us. And what I think is really important in this grief cycle that we're in is to realize what we have, to discover what we've taken for granted, and now to live in a new way. Friends, I want to end with a story. And the story is about a lady called Edith Rockefeller McCormick. And Edith Rockefeller McCormick was the daughter of Rockefeller, John Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, the business tycoon. And she had lots of servants in her house, and she had one rule, and one rule only, is that you couldn't go up to her and address her without her speaking to you first. As a servant, the only time you could speak is when you were spoken to. And one night she was hosting a party, and her son had died of scarlet fever that night, and she didn't know. She didn't know. And the servants decided they would break the rule and go tell her. And what did she do? Or they walked up to her and spoke to her and said, and whispered in her ear, your son has died. And she nodded and carried on with the party. I don't know about you, but when grief hits us, we have two responses. We can either just ignore it, or we can embrace it. We can either embrace it and learn from it, and we can see what is valuable. We can either pretend as if it doesn't exist, or we can learn from it. And as we go through this grief process that we're going through at the moment, I pray that we start to learn from it. I pray that we really engage with it, that we don't run away from it, that we really hold on to it and see what it is trying to teach us. Because when this all goes back to normal, when life returns to some form of normality, I hope and pray that we start to value things that we took for granted. So friends, may God hold you. May God keep you. May you keep safe during this pandemic. And if there's anything we can do to help, if anything I can do, if you need a chat, if you're struggling with something, please be in contact. Have a great morning and enjoy the rest of your week.